In this video, I'm going to show you roughly 50 tips in Logic Pro that will help your productivity and workflow. Instead of just having 50 tips randomly jumbled and edited together, I kind of wanted to take a different approach with this video. I spent some time planning this video out and arranged these tips in a way so that I can actually show you them practically in use. So what I'm going to do is actually open Logic and show you these tips in real time while I make some music. Now the point obviously with this video is not to make a great piece of music, but just to show you in a real life context and setting how I would actually use these tips while I'm making music. These tips range from beginner to advanced, so make sure you watch all the way to the end of the video, and I'm pretty sure that you'll pick up at least a handful of tips that will help your workflow out. That being said, let's get into it. All right, so let's go ahead and open Logic. I'm gonna go File, New from Template. And I'm gonna use this template that I use pretty much to start every single session, aptly named One Template to Rule Them All. So you'll see this template loads in about 5 to 10 seconds for me, and if I scroll all the way to the bottom here, you will notice that I have 613 tracks in here, so this really has just about everything I need. If I hit H, you can see all the hidden tracks and track stacks that I have in here. And the reason that I hide these is just so I don't have to scroll like crazy when I'm working on music, so I'll go ahead and hide those again with H. So the way that I have this template set up is basically everything that I use more than, once in a blue moon. It's just ready and at my fingertips, so I'm not spending time loading instruments and routing my reverbs and delays and all that kind of stuff, and I can just instantly pull up what I need, get to making music, and just saves me a ton of time. So big tip there is to, create a template that you can start from, and I'll touch on that a little bit later in the video. All right, so before we actually get to making some music, we're gonna adjust some settings that will help the process as we go. So first we're gonna go up to Logic Pro, Preferences, and then General. And actually first we're gonna go over to this Advanced tab and just make sure you have all these boxes checked. That will enable us to do a lot more things down the road, and will give you a lot more editing options and just open more things up to you. So if you don't have all these checked, you won't actually be able to do everything. And then if we go back to General here, so the first thing we're going to do here, if you see where it says right mouse button, we're going to select is assignable to a tool. And what you'll see if you didn't already have that selected is it adds a third tool right over here. And I have mine as my scissor tool. So now instead of changing to my scissor tool, I can actually just use my right click on my mouse to use a scissor. And then down here, you want to make sure that you check fade tool click zones and marquee tool click zones. And I'll show you what those do a little bit later as well. All right, next we're going to go to File, Project Settings, and then Audio. And here you just want to make sure that you have the right sample rate selected. So this is actually part of my template. I'm not aware if Logic Pro still does this, but years ago before I made a template, Logic always defaulted to 44.1. However, since most of what I do is in the sync world, the industry standard is 48K. So I just have that as part of my template. So every time I open Logic, it's just going to be to 48K right away. The other thing we're going to do here is click on Midi. And then if you click on Chase, this is a really cool feature that I wish I would have learned about, much before I did. But if you click on this notes box, you can kind of copy my settings if you'd like. What this is actually going to do is, say you have very long MIDI notes, like if you have a long pad or any long MIDI notes at all. If you don't have this checked, then you actually have to start the playhead before that MIDI note to hear anything. Like you may have noticed, you start the playhead in the middle of a MIDI region and you don't hear anything. If you have this checked, it actually will trigger that MIDI data. So this is super helpful to have as well. Go ahead and close out of here. All right, and the last setting we're going to set up here is this snap drop-down menu. So if you click on this, just make sure you have this option checked right here for snap edits to 0 crossings. What this is going to do is, let's say if you're ever working with audio and you use your scissor tool or you're chopping audio at all, it's actually going to move those edits. I mean, you won't notice a big difference, but it's going to actually move them to the nearest to 0 crossing point. So what that's actually going to do is avoid any clicks and pops, so that'll save you a lot of headache as well. Now that we've got those, settings set up, let's go ahead and actually start making some music. So I'm going to start like I typically do with my pianos and keys. So we'll just get a chord progression going. So say I'll start with this hybrid keys. And another quick tip here to save a lot of CPU is to offload your instruments. As you'll see over on the channel strip here, this is sort of grayed out. If I open my mixer window, you can see all the instruments I have in this folder. Notice how they're all just sort of like grayed out a little bit there. So what that means is those instruments are actually offloaded. So if I turn this one on here, you'll see now it's actually loading the plugin. So that's part of the reason why my template was able to load so fast, because even though I have over 600 tracks, and not all of those are software instruments, a lot are audio as well, but it's actually not loading all those different instruments. So the instruments don't actually load until I turn them off. So some people will show you, if you just turn this off here, that you're going to offload your instrument, but that's actually not the case. So if you see when I turn that off, the instrument is actually still loaded. So it's still loading, it's still taking up CPU. However, when the instrument is on here, if you hold Option and then click this power button, see how now it's grayed out? That's actually going to offload the instrument. So super helpful tip there as well. All right, now that we've got some of those settings out of the way, let's actually go ahead and get started making some music. So as we're getting ready to record, you can hit K to turn your metronome on or off, toggle that, and then we're just going to go ahead and hit R to record, and I'll just lay down a basic chord progression here to get started. All right, so once you have that recorded, with the MIDI region highlighted here, if we hit P, that will bring up the piano roll. It's going to drag this and make it a little bigger. Now let's say if you want to zoom within this window or the arrange window, let's go ahead and click in the piano roll, so that's what we're affecting. You can either hold Command and use your arrow keys, which is the way that I like to do it, or if you hold Option, you can scroll with your mouse. So some faster ways to zoom instead of, going all the way up here to your normal zoom controls. But like I said, I like to use Command and the arrow keys. It just works a little smoother for me. So now that we're in this piano roll, let's go ahead and edit this performance, tighten it up a little bit. And of course, if you want to leave it more human-like, that's fine, but just kind of showing you some different workflow, tips and tools in case you want to use them. So first, let's go ahead. If your performance is a little bit sloppy, you might want to change your quantize settings here to something not quite as tight. So let's say if you were more than a 16th note off, maybe change this to quarter note. We're going to go ahead in this window and do Cmd A to select all. And then if you just hit Q, that will quantize your performance. Now, let's say if we want to connect all these notes together, so there's not these random spaces, we can do Cmd A again to highlight or select all. And then if you do Shift backspace, it will actually do what's, I think, technically called a forced legato. But what that's going to do is it's just going to make all the notes, connected in their length. So we'll hit shorten, boom, perfect, just like that. Or another way to do that, let's say with this first chord, if these are all different lengths and you wanted to adjust those together, you can highlight those, hold Shift and then drag, and they will all drag to the same length. Okay, now let's say if we wanted to edit the velocity, let's say if this is a synth part or something else where you just want all the velocity to be the same and edit it all together. Again, we're going to do Command A to select all, and then if you hold Option and Shift, then you can actually just drag this velocity slider and you'll adjust them all at the same time. So let's go back to the arrange window here. Now let's say if this MIDI region was somewhere out in the middle here and you wanted to, adjust your cycle or this loop length at the top to be around this MIDI region. With that selected, you can just hit U and it will change, your cycle length up here, your loop to be around this MIDI region or whatever you have selected. And then of course you can push C to toggle that on and off. Let's just go ahead and bring this back to the beginning. All right, now that we've got our chord progression recorded and started, let's go ahead and make a bass line. So I'm just going to drag my low synths folder here up so we can kind of see everything. Now, if you want to create the bass line from that chord progression and use the same MIDI data, there's a few different ways to do that. So one way, we could hold Option and then drag this, and that's going to copy it. Right, there's one way to do it. And then if you don't want to do that, obviously Cmd Z is Undo, Shift Cmd Z is Redo. Another way to drag that would be to simply copy and paste. So we could do Cmd C, and then in this track, Cmd V, right? And then if you do it, obviously the playhead's at the start, it'll do it where you want it. Right, so either way, just to get that MIDI data there, we'll go ahead and turn this one on. Now let's say if we wanted to rename this bass, with the track selected, you can do Shift, Enter, and we'll just call this low synth bass. Right, and then if we want to change this MIDI region to the same name, we can do Option Shift N, and then to match the color is Option Shift C. And we'll just hit P now to bring up the piano roll. All right, now that we have the same MIDI data in the bass track, obviously we don't want to be playing these chords with the bass, we just want the root notes. With this chord progression, I purposely just did everything in root position to kind of show how you would do this, to create a bass line from the same MIDI data. So when you're in this piano roll, if you hold Shift and then hit your top arrow, that will actually choose the top note of the chords. And the opposite of that, obviously, if you hold Shift and hit the bottom arrow on your keypad, that will select just the bottom notes of the chords. Now what we want to do obviously is just have those and delete everything else. So with these bottom notes selected, if you do Shift I, it will select the inverse, which is just the opposite of whatever you have highlighted. So now that we have everything else except the bass notes highlighted, we can just hit backspace or delete, and we'll just hit S to solo this and listen to see if this is in the right octave. And in the context with the keys. Now personally, I think the bass would sound a lot better an octave lower. So what we're going to do again is Command A to select all these notes. And if you just wanted to move notes one at a time, you can hold Option and then use your arrow keys up or down. Right, but in this situation, since we want to drop the bass an entire octave and keep the notes the same, we're going to do Option and Shift together and then use the down arrow, and that will actually drop that bass down an octave, which is, you know, what we're looking for. All right, so now that we've got our chords laid down, we've got a bass line, let's go ahead and actually start structuring the song. So I like to do this pretty early. It just sort of gives me a guideline of what I'm doing, whether I'm making a track for an artist or doing a cue for sync. I just like to get the different sections structured out so I can kind of have a roadmap. So what we're gonna do is hit G to open our global tracks. And then I prefer to use the markers. I don't really like the arrangement feature. It just works a little bit better with my workflow. So I'm gonna right click and get rid of everything else. All right, now that we have just our marker showing, we're going to do Option apostrophe to create a new marker, and then Shift apostrophe to rename that marker. And we'll just call this intro. Maybe give ourselves a 4-bar intro, and at bar 5 or measure 5, we'll do again Option apostrophe and then Shift apostrophe. This will be our verse. Make maybe an 8-bar verse, and then we will maybe throw in a pre-chorus. And then a chorus here. All right, and you can continue to add markers and name them for your entire song or whatever, obviously, but for the sake of this video and example, it's probably good enough for now. Now let's go ahead and color code these markers just to make it a little bit easier on the eyes, and I just personally like you know, having things organized a little bit, and it's just looks a little nicer. So if you go ahead and click on this intro marker here, and then do Option or Alt C, go ahead and pick a color for this. Do the same for the verse, just picking random colors here. So there's how you can do that. All right, now that we've got our arrangement and our structure sort of laid out, let's keep working on the song. So like I said before, you can use Command C and Command V, let's say if you wanted to copy these keys out, or another really easy way is just Command R. So we'll just Command R twice here, copy that out, and then same for the bass. And then let's say for the pre-chorus, we wanted to say like have a felt piano, like switch up the sound. So I'm just gonna scroll down here, and I'm going to use the Noir felt, so I'll just drag this to the top. And I'll turn this one on so it will load the library. All right, unfortunately my camera stopped recording because I ran out of space and I didn't realize, so hopefully I'm back in the right spot here. But now that we've got our keys and our bass line laid down, let's keep working on the song. And I actually did notice that in my markers here, I accidentally made the pre-chorus only 2 bars instead of 4. So if we just hit G to open this back up, we can just drag the chorus here back 2 more bars. All right, hit G to close that back out. All right, now let's say we wanted to use a felt piano for the pre-chorus. I actually already have that turned on, so that happened when my camera turned off here. One thing, and this is a good spot as well to show key commands and how to set those up, because I just really like to use different key commands and hotkeys for my process and my workflow. It just makes things a lot faster and a lot smoother. So I actually have it set up in Logic to do Option Shift Q to open my sample library or my plugin. And then for any audio plugins, I have it set up for Option Shift 1, 2, 3, and so on, depending on what plugin. So as you can see, I have an EQ here. I can just do Option Shift 1, and that will open that up. So I'll go ahead and show you how to set that up here. If you go up to Logic Pro, and then Key Commands and Edit, or as you can see, the key command is just Alt-K. So let's go back to the Arrange window here and use the key command, Alt-K. And as you can see, I already have this typed in here in the search, but if you just search for open close, you'll see all these different key commands that you can set up, and typically these are blank. So I'll just go ahead and delete this first one here and show you how to set it up yourself. So I'll highlight that and hit delete. Now to teach it a key label or a key command, you just hit learn by key position. So again, we're going to do Option Shift Q and then click on that again to turn it off so you don't mess anything up. So that's how you can set up your own key commands, which I highly recommend that you do. So let's say if we just wanted to copy the same MIDI data for the felt piano, and I'm sure someone in the comments is going to tell me how wrong it is to copy and paste, but you know, just for setting up a track, structuring, arranging, it's very, you know, it's okay. It's okay to do it this way, I promise. Everything's going to be all right. You can always go back and change things later. Again, like I said, you can either Option drag or Command C and Command V to copy and paste. Or let's say if this MIDI data was already here, like you had your, you know, first keys instrument playing and you're like, you know what, I think that'd be better on a felt piano. If we click on this felt piano track here, have this one highlighted like I showed you, and then click on the MIDI, this MIDI region that you want to move, and highlight that, and we'll do Ctrl Shift T, and that will actually move it to the selected track. Now again, we're going to do Option Shift N to rename the track. I'm not used to thinking about these key commands. It's just sort of like secondhand nature, so sometimes I get a little bit tripped up when I actually have to think about them. All right, so now that we have this noir here, one thing that I like to do a lot in pre-chorus, like if I'm using a key instrument like this or some sort of sustained chords, I will actually go in and reverse the final chord so it kind of like swells into the chorus. So to do that, I'll show you a quick and easy way, and you can use this obviously in many different applications. We're going to go ahead and chop this last chord and then bounce that to audio. So one way you could do that, if you recall, we set up our third tool to be the scissor. So you can just right click there and it will chop that. And again, Command Z to undo. Now another thing you can do, let's say if you want to do, you know, reverse each chord individually but still have them play in order. So you're going to want to reverse each one, you know, one at a time. You can just click on the first bar here. So you're one bar into this MIDI region, hold Option and then right click or use your scissor tool. And now as you'll see, that just evenly chopped those all one bar. But for this example, that's not what we're doing. So we're going to highlight these three and then do Command J, and that will rejoin those. So now let's click on this final chord that we do want to reverse and highlight that. We're going to do Control B to bounce in place. And I'll just call this reverse felt final chord and hit OK to bounce that. Now, since this is going to be playing on top of, you know, the original felt piano, we don't want this last chord to be muted. By default, Logic will mute that. So what you can do is click on this and do Control M to unmute. And let's say like before, we had all these chopped, and for whatever reason, you bounced two of them. Let's say this one and this one were muted. An easy way to unmute or mute all of those is if you do Shift M, it will highlight all of the muted regions, and then Control M again to unmute those. And again, we'll just highlight all of these, do Command J to join those regions. Now to reverse this final chord, what we're going to do, the slow way to do it would be to go over to this region here and then click on the More drop down and then reverse. Right, but that takes a lot longer than just knowing the key command. All right, so what we're going to do instead is use the key command. So click on this audio here and then Control Shift R, and that will reverse the audio. Go ahead and listen to what this sounds like. Again, if you click on this region here and hit U, you can just create the cycle there. So it will play whatever you have cycled. Right, so that reversed final chord just really swells up into the chorus nicely. All right, and now that we have this reversed final chord, if you recall earlier in the video, I showed you the fade tool click zones and the marquee tool click zones. So what that is, the marquee tool click zone you can use on MIDI or audio. So if you're scrolling in the bottom half of any region, you'll actually activate your marquee tool. So you can just click and drag and use that. But if you're using audio, you also have in the top half your fade tool click zone. So again, bottom half is marquee tool click zone, and then top half you can just click and drag to add a fade. So anytime you need a fade, that's super handy. And then obviously, since we have our right mouse click as a third tool, you can't right click on stuff. So if instead you do a control click, you can change that to a speed up or a slow down, which is super handy as well. All right, so now that we've got the song structured out a little bit, let's go ahead and look at some things you can do with vocals. So for the sake of this example, I just pulled in a vocal loop. Now, if you're using vocal loops, obviously you're going to want to heavily process them or change them so you're not running into problems with splice or any issues like that. That's a whole other topic. But let's just say so this vocal that I pulled in is actually already in A minor, which is the key of our song. But if you did need to transpose that, what you can do is click on this vocal here and then go to Region and Transpose, and you can adjust that. Or just like the MIDI data I showed you earlier, you can do Option and then up or down arrows. But since this is already in the right key, we don't need to do that. And then as far as adjusting the tempo, One thing you can do, although I don't recommend, and I'll tell you why in a second, is just hold Option and then drag the end of the file to adjust it and add it to the, make it line up on the grid. However, I don't like to do that because sometimes different samples and loops will actually have extra dead space on the end. So like, let's say if it was a 2-bar loop, but the recording went beyond the 2-bar and they just left that in. If you're spacing that, it's not going to adjust properly, if that makes sense. So what I like to do instead is you can either click on this and double click it to open your audio editor, or just click on it and hit E, that's the shortcut. And then we're going to go to File, Functions, and then Time and Pitch Machine. So then we're going to choose the original tempo here, which is the tempo of the vocal loop. So we'll put in 75, and the destination is the project BPM, or what you want it to be converted to, which ours is 77. So not a huge change, but just hit Process and Paste. Close out of this, and as you can see, that's exactly kind of what I was pointing out. See how there's this extra space, because that just means that there's extra space in the original loop. So if I would have just Option dragged that, it wouldn't have actually lined up with the project. So let's just go ahead and bring this down a little bit, maybe add some reverb, which again, part of my template, I already have my reverb sense set up, and I'll talk about that here in just a little bit. Let's go ahead and listen to this and see if it fits. That works for this context. Now, another thing you can do when editing vocals is, I used to do this manually, and I wish I would have known this a long time ago, but that is when we're talking about cutting out the silence. It's like, let's say if I wanted to, cut out the silence here, I might just use my Marquee tool, click, and then delete the silence. But a much easier way to do that is if you highlight this, the vocal loop or the audio file, and then you do Ctrl X, that's going to open up the strip silence. And you may need to adjust the settings. So like, let's say if it was, much more intense, obviously that's not going to be what we want. So you kind of want to adjust the threshold. All right, and then make sure you have Search Zero Crossing checked here. And again, that's going to avoid any clicks and pops. Hit OK. And that just removed the silence for us. Now at this point, another thing that I really like to do is lock these in place. So if we click on this track here, it will highlight all the audio regions, and then we're going to do Command Page Down, and that's going to, you can see how this lock symbol disappeared. That's going to lock those to the SMPTE timecode. So even if you drag these around, they're going to be locked in place. There's a bunch of different situations and reasons, in which this can be super helpful. So for example, like when I'm working with a vocalist, I'll import all the vocals, and then at the top, I will create a new track called Vocal Comp. So let's just rename this one Vocal Comp, and I'll kind of show you what I'm talking about. Now let's say these two, different vocals were from different takes. Now let's say as I'm putting this together, if I'm dragging this up to my Vocal Comp and I accidentally slide it over here, well, if I have that SMPTE timecode locked, it keeps it right in place, which is super handy. And as I'm moving things around, sometimes even you accidentally click on something, if you have, those locked to the timecode, they're not going to be moving around on you. So even if I do this way over here, it's still going to lock it right in place. And if we listen, these are still, exactly where they were.
I wish I knew. I wish I knew you.
Now another thing I like to do with vocals especially, but a lot of times with audio, is automation, and I use the Logic Gain plugin for this, for what I'm going to show you. I personally don't really like to automate the volume itself, because if you have automation data on the volume, then you can't actually adjust the volume fader like when you're mixing, because it's going to be locked into that automation data. So an easy workaround for that, if we just throw on a gain plugin, we'll go down here to audio units. Actually, we'll just use the Logic, and yours will probably just be called Gain, because I renamed mine because I have another plugin that's called Gain. So we'll just throw that on there, and then if you hit A to open up your automation window, we'll scroll in here. Now, as you can see, when you're in the automation view, you don't have that Marquee tool click zone anymore. So again, it's easy to just memorize key commands, but if you hit T, that will open up your tools, and then R is Marquee. And so let's just say, for the sake of example, that this little bit here is like a mouth noise or a consonant that I want to automate out. An easy thing you can do, of course we need to change this to gain. An easy thing you can do with your Marquee tool selected is just select this little bit, then hit T twice to go back to your pointer tool, click, and drag that down. So that's a much, much faster way than drawing in those 4 automation points yourself, because it drew in those 4 for you, and you can just quickly do that. Now, of course, that doesn't look that fast when I'm explaining this, for the sake of this video, but just to kind of show you in a real context, I just open this, choose my selection, and it's that fast, you know. So instead of like manually doing all these little things, just knowing these key commands and these quick workflow tips, it's just going to save you tons and tons of time over the long haul. All right, another tip that I really wanted to show that didn't really fit in anywhere neatly as far as like the workflow goes, but another thing that really helps save CPU is freezing tracks. And I know this is something that a lot of people talk about. However, I'm going to show you a slightly different way that I think is a little bit better, that I prefer to do it. So I'm going to shorten the session here so it doesn't have as much to process. So what freezing tracks does is it's sort of similar to bouncing to audio, but it's different, obviously. So what it's actually doing is saving that audio, so it's not loading the sample library every single time. So I'll just show you in context an easy way to do that. And if you don't have this snowflake here, you can right click and then go to track header components and just make sure that you have freeze here checked. But we'll just go ahead and click freeze here, and then you hit spacebar to play and it will freeze the track. All right, so now you can see that this is frozen and I can no longer edit anything. So it's going to save some CPU. It's not still loading those samples in that sample library, but I don't prefer to do it this way. So what I actually like to do is, if you go to track here and then freeze mode, change this from pre-fader to source only. You'll notice that this switches from green to blue, and then we'll hit spacebar again to freeze. Now the difference here is it's still going to freeze the sample library or your virtual instrument. See that it still has that snowflake, I can't change that. However, because it froze only the source, I can still add audio plugins. So of course this isn't going to save you quite as much CPU, but I prefer to do it this way because, you know, I might not be changing this MIDI data, like, you know, that might be my chord progression, it's set in stone, but I still might want to process that differently as I'm working on my song and as I'm mixing. So now that I've frozen the source only, I can still go in here and, you know, adjust my EQ if I want to do a low cut, or if I need to do any other cuts or whatever processing you need to do, you know, add more plugins. And I just like to do it this way because it works with my workflow a little bit better. And as I said, I can continue to mix that sound and add audio plugins. As I mentioned at the beginning of the video, one of the biggest tips that I can give you is to create a template, you know, and to work with templates. As you can see, you know, this template has all my different instruments loaded and they're all grouped together. So I have instrument groups in these track stacks. Everything's color coded. I have my sample rate set. I have my delay sends, my reverb sends already ready to go. And I have it set up so it's really easy to do like different alt mixes and sub mixes for sync work and just all kinds of stuff that just makes my workflow super, super easy and super optimized. Going through this whole template and kind of showing you how it's set up and how everything works would take a whole video in and of itself. And luckily for you, I actually already did record that video. So I have a whole video going through, you know, why I use a template, how I set my template up, and then I recreate one from scratch so that you can do the same. So if that sounds like something you would benefit from and something you want to check out, go ahead and click on the video that's up on the screen now, and I'll see you there. If not, either way, thanks for watching. Have a good day.